People see me and think they're safer. But it's not really me they're seeing. Probably for the best. Knowing everything hinges on a guy from Queens sounds as scary as it feels. No pressure, right?
So Marvel's Spider-Man for me is one of the most fascinating games that has come out in the last few years, and definitely of this console generation. It's the first AAA Marvel game in who knows how long, and ever since 2016 has had a really high bar set for it. I haven't seen this much hype and anticipation for a game in a very long time. There have been entire communities founded online because of this game that now even have an Easter egg in the final build. So being a huge Spider-Man fan myself, this was something that I've wanted for a long time, and to see that Insomniac would finally be giving us a new interesting Spider-Man experience was crazy. We'd had games from the last generation like Shattered Dimensions, Spider-Man 3, that were overall a really solid lineup, but nothing close to the level that it seemed like this game would be on. So now that the game has been out for a little while and we've all got a chance to hopefully play it, I want to take a look at just the entire game as a whole. Pretty much everything from the story to the gameplay to the mechanics, the side missions, just anything and everything that this game has to offer. Just a quick reminder that this will include spoilers, so if you have not beaten the game yet or you just don't want to know anything that happens, be sure to click off this video and save it for later, and there will also be timestamps in the description below, since I'm not sure how long this video will end up being. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Majestic Gaming for Spider-Man game videos in the future. So out of everything that we were all looking forward to in this game, I'd say one of the biggest things for me personally was going to be the story and just the entire universe. Leading up to its release, we all knew that this game was going to be Insomniac's own personal take on the Spider-Man and Marvel universe. This Peter Parker was older, hadn't been with Mary Jane for a while, and just the entire structure of the universe was different. Also, Insomniac was being really secretive on different parts of the game, like who Peter's boss was and who all the different villains were going to be. It was just really exciting, and looking back on it, I haven't been that excited for a game story in a really long time. So now that it's out, I can officially say that it's a really good story, and definitely one of the best things about the game. First, you can't really talk about it unless you first mention the way it's presented, which in this case are going to be the cutscenes, and these look absolutely incredible. I'd expected a lot since the trailers leading up to this game look so good, but actually seeing them in-game just blew my mind, even on a 5-year-old console. I had high expectations obviously, but it is worth noting that every cutscene involving Spider-Man looked great. Some of the characters like Miles start to look a little weird in some of the cutscenes, but nothing that ever took me out of the experience. It was still always incredible, and every time Spider-Man was on screen it was just amazing, and I felt like I was a little kid again watching that Marvel Kids video again with him and Iron Man and Spider-Man and the Hulk and all that, and it was just awesome. But setting the stage for this universe, Peter Parker has been Spider-Man for 8 years now, Aunt May works at the Feast Shelter, and Peter and Mary Jane have been spoken for 6 months after breaking up. Just from the opening cinematic you can tell how much Insomniac nailed the tone of the character. The music, his attitude, his room, and just the entire presentation of the cutscene was great. Now like I said, I love Spider-Man. I think he's a super relatable character, and he's most commonly just known as being a high school student, and that's something that I can easily relate to. However, this version of Spider-Man has been really prevalent lately. I don't have a problem with that, but especially when you see movies like Homecoming where it's really apparent that he's just a kid, it's just nice to have a version that's more mature, but also feels like he's still Peter Parker. Thankfully, his character stays super engaging throughout the entire story, which was necessary for this game to work, and it does. Also, I'll mention this now, the performances in the game are all really great, especially Yuri Lowenthal, who voices Spider-Man, gives an incredible performance that especially later in the story you can really feel. So you have the story that begins with Peter leaving his apartment as Spider-Man going to fight the Kingpin. I thought this was a pretty cool choice, as Kingpin is a pretty classic Spider-Man villain we've all come to expect in his game, but he's not someone that I really would have loved to see as a main villain throughout, so we can go ahead and just fight him and get it out of the way. way. Also in this mission we're first introduced to Yuri, who is Spider-Man's friend, I guess, our associate, who's a cop. She's really only there to give information about what's going on in the story, but the banter she has with Spider-Man was really entertaining, and even though her character doesn't really have much to her, she was still entertaining while she was on screen. Pretty much all the dialogue I will say that she had in the game was top notch, and not just with her, but with her and Spider-Man, and just Spider-Man and all the different characters was really good. Especially later when we get to all the stuff with Peter and Mary Jane, all of their scenes together just felt amazing, and I honestly would have just been okay with more of that in the game. Also, Peter's jokes I actually thought were pretty funny. Obviously one of Spider-Man's defining traits is his sense of humor and just kind of the bad jokes he tells, and even in the first 30 minutes of the game, I heard one of these like jokes that just had me cracking up, and it was really dumb, but that definitely is a good sign. So after Spider-Man defeats Kingpin, he then goes to his job, where we meet his mysterious employer, who to no one's surprise was Otto Octavius. Obviously Insomniac kept this hidden as much as possible, but we all knew that it was something science related, and we all knew that there was a mystery member of the Sinister Six, so most people figured out really fast that it was probably going to be Doc Ock. Thankfully though, I do think Insomniac does a very good job with his character in a really cool interpretation. The entire way his story plays out sort of reminds me of a combination between the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon version and Alfred Molina's version from Spider-Man 2. You get the impression that he's a really cool dude who just wants to make the world a better place through science. Still, he does walk in on Peter fixing his Spidey costume, and although he tells Peter differently, I think most of us knew at that point that he did figure out that Peter was Spider-Man. This is also the explanation of where the advanced suit comes from, and then we get an awesome cutscene of him trying it out for the first time, once again with that same awesome Spider-Man tone and music. We then meet Aunt May at the feast shelter, and this is another part of the game that I thought was really well done. I enjoyed this take on Aunt May as she has all the qualities that make her that essential Spider-Man character. We also meet Martin Lee. If you've seen any of the promos for this game, you know that he does turn into Mr. Negative, and once again, like Otto, he seems like just a cool and nice dude who wants to help people, or at least it seems that way. We then are also introduced to Mary Jane with her gameplay, which, trust me, I have a lot of stuff to talk about with that later, but just from her first moments on screen, I really enjoyed this take on MJ. I think it's a pretty appropriate modernization of her that also just makes her a more interesting character for Peter to interact with. Like I already mentioned, all of their scenes together from this point forward I think are fantastic, and really some of the best moments of the game. One thing I will say that I really appreciate is that the game actually takes its time to set up the story. Although Otto becoming Doc Ock was super obvious and heavily foreshadowed, it was still set up pretty well, I thought. The next big player we meet is Norman Osborn, who is pretty interesting, and going into the game was one of the characters I was most curious to see what they would do. There is something about this version that seems more likable, and maybe like how you could see how people would actually vote for him for mayor, but he also maintains that classic Norman Osborn feeling of uneasiness and corruption, and it's also necessary to pull together all the different threads of the story later in the game. And like I said, for a good chunk of the game, you're not really doing anything too crucial. You fight Shocker, help Otto some more, fight some crime, talk with Yuri, and not too much else. Once again, the moments with Otto are mandatory to make his betrayal have more weight. However, I was really surprised and excited when I got to the mission with Jefferson Davis. We all knew Miles was in the game, but I don't think any of us really expected his dad to play a significant role in the story. This version of Jefferson is a cop as opposed to a SHIELD agent, and the second he showed up on screen, I figured he was gonna die. You get the entire mission to get to know him, and once again, you get the impression that he's just a really cool dude who wants to help everyone he can, so I was like, alright, he's gonna die just so Miles can kind of have his story. However, I will say that they did get me because they sort of trick you in the end of the mission into thinking that he dies, but he doesn't actually, so from that point on, I just didn't think too much about his character. Now, as the story starts progressing, the gang led by Mr. Negative, called the Demon, starts moving into the city, and I thought the development of all this was kind of a little weird because the player playing the game most likely knows that Martin Lee is Mr. Negative, but Peter doesn't know that, so he eventually just discovers it, but I don't really feel like there was much reaction from it or much else from it, just kind of besides the simple, he is a good man, how could he do this? Either way, we do then move on to one of the biggest standout moments of the entire story, which for me is the City Hall attack. The entire ceremony in the first place is to honor Jefferson Davis, but since it's a video game, something obviously goes wrong, and it does, and an explosion goes off and kills a lot of people, including Jefferson. And the entire presentation of this cutscene, I think, is very well done. The music and just the shifting between first person and third person just really added to the experience without overdoing it. I was kind of worried that it would just overdo that entire kind of gimmick, but it didn't, thankfully, and I thought it was really well done. This is also where we're fully introduced to Miles, where he has to find his dad's body, which is obviously a rough scene to watch. Once again, the performances here by everyone are stellar, and I just wasn't expecting to feel that much at that time in the story. This event also does a good job of setting up a believable way that these characters like Miles and Peter would come together. Once again, the story just sort of continues, and I don't want to sound like I'm talking about this in a negative way, but it does just kind of feel like your typical superhero story. It's not really a bad thing because The story itself and the scope of it I wouldn't say are really the focus. It more lies with Peter and his development and all the central characters and how they interact with him. But that's obviously what we're here to see, so I enjoyed it. The next character that we're also introduced to is Silver Sable, who is one of the more mixed parts of the story in my opinion. Her introduction is cool, even though she somehow is able to fight Spider-Man like one-on-one and win every time, and she also jumps from a helicopter with no superpowers and doesn't die. Whatever. I get they wanted to make her a strong, important character, but I already got that from Mary Jane, and she was never doing inhuman feats that would definitely break her legs. I enjoyed her character, but she sort of just disappears for a large part of the story, just to show up near the end again, and I also didn't feel like she was really necessary at all, and the only reason she's even in the game is to have one more character, and so that the Sable agents can be in the city for Spider-Man to fight, and for more city content. Moving on from that though, Spider-Man gets evicted, and has to track down his stuff from a garbage truck. This was the moment that I realized that Insomniac truly understood what made Spider-Man so relatable and enjoyable to read. There's a little bit more with Martin Lee, a little bit more stuff with Otto, and we're also treated to one of the best cutscenes in the game just between Mary Jane and Peter in her apartment. If it sounds like I'm jumping around a lot, that's basically because that's what the story does too. I feel like Insomniac got really ambitious with what they wanted to do, and in the story you jump between Peter's personal stuff, Mary Jane's stuff, stuff with Aunt May, stuff with Martin Lee, stuff with Otto, stuff with Norman Osborn, stuff with Silver Sable, and then in there you also throw Miles and the Sinister Six. It's a ton of stuff, and it's a lot of content for one game, and I think it's balanced mostly well. I just think they could have scaled some of it back a little bit without losing the gameplay elements that they brought to the game. There is also some business stuff story with like Oscorp and these doctors whose names I don't even remember because it doesn't really matter too much, but it does lead to the development of a bioweapon that matters later. Another thing about the story that I really enjoyed was that it wasn't afraid to get dark. Spider-Man's mostly happy character, but there's some pretty scary stuff in this game when just random people get gunned down by the demons or Mr. Negative forces a dude to kill himself. Also, Peter and Mary Jane, after becoming partners, also kind of just get mad at each other at some point for a sort of believable reason, so I guess it was okay. It just kind of felt like one of those story steps that we always have to go through, even though that we know they're always going to end up together at the end. I did enjoy though how they were naturally, for the most part, setting up Otto's turn into Doc Ock. You see him developing the arms, and Peter even says at one point, this could cause a personality change, so it's pretty obvious if you know anything about Spider-Man. Once again, they also continue to build up the relationship between Peter and Miles, all in natural ways, and I thought it was great. When Peter goes to the raft to start trying to contain the supervillains, this is where we get the big reveal that wasn't really a reveal at all, that Otto was Doc Ock, and I guess in charge of everything. It had literally been 10 minutes ago when we saw him, and he was getting a little angry, but he wasn't a straight up mass murderer. So either that was like genuine and this whole thing doesn't make any sense, or for a while he's been controlling with these other villains, like working with them, and he was faking it before, and he just now decides to reveal himself with a snazzy new suit and evil personality. Obviously, just looking at it from a Spider-Man perspective, it was really cool hearing the music and seeing the tentacles and seeing Doc Ock in this game and in this universe, but I really was just thinking, wait, wasn't he cool like 10 minutes ago, and what was he doing this whole time? And that seems like it sort of came out of nowhere. Again, I get what they were going for, I just think the final execution was a little rushed and a little forced. After this, he also releases the bioweapon in the city, and from this point on I thought the story was really engaging. People are dying left and right, Aunt May is sick, and there's just criminals taking over the entire city. I especially thought the cutscene where Peter saves Aunt May from like the burning fire and the burning building, and then Miles ends up saving Peter, was really well done and just super engaging. Norman Osborn also shows back up here, who, very similar to Silver Sable, doesn't really do too much in the entire story. Unlike Silver Sable, however, he is necessary, like I said earlier, to tie everything together. There's also a little bit more development with Miles, where you actually get to see why he will most likely become Spider-Man eventually. You also learn more about the Osborns when Mary Jane is in their penthouse, and this was actually pretty awesome. The entire game you hear about how Harry is in Europe apparently, and obviously you know that something's going on because it's the Osborns, and it's just really interesting kind of going through and piecing everything together about the mystery and how he was sick and how Norman forced him to stay to get treatment, and we don't even really know by the end of the game what's going on with him. You also learn how Martin Lee was experimented on and accidentally killed his parents when he was a kid. Again, I thought this was super interesting, but this is really the last thing that happens with him in the story before his defeat. I would have liked to see that be explored maybe a little bit more earlier in the story, to give more character to the Martin Lee side of him. Besides, he's a pretty cool dude, but he's actually not because he's evil. Another thing in the penthouse that had me really excited was the infamous black spider with the 42 written on it. And obviously once I saw that, I was super excited about Miles getting his powers, and that of course ends up happening. As near the end of the game, you defeat Mr. Negative, Norman Osborn is taken captive by Doc Ock, and you of course team up with Silver Sable. Again, I enjoyed this while it was happening, but right after this she just leaves and then she's out of the story forever. Their whole conflict they had throughout the game felt kind of dumb and just unnecessary, and then I didn't hate her, like I actually really enjoyed her character, I just didn't think she was necessary in an already already insanely crowded story. I did think it was cool though how she ended up saving Spider-Man by the end by bringing him to the Feast Shelter. Then you enter the end of the game after a pretty cool boss fight with Doc Ock. You get a couple cutscenes between them, and these actually felt really great to me. Just all of Peter and Doc Ock's dialogue together was amazing, and Peter felt so much like the best version of this character that I could possibly imagine. Again, Yuri Lowenthal absolutely killed it in his performance in these final scenes, and even though Otto's transition from scientist to full-on supervillain felt a little rushed to me, you still really felt for Peter at the end, since you did see so much of their friendship together. It reminded me a lot of the Superior Spider-Man story, and Otto even sort of gives a "with great power comes great responsibility" speech at the end that I absolutely loved. And I even thought, like, at the end that they might give you a choice to help Otto or not, but they didn't, and I was actually pretty happy about this, since I didn't want to have to make that choice. Then we get to the very ending of the game, in the cutscene that absolutely killed me. So as we started moving throughout the story, I started thinking more and more about how similar this is to Arkham, and how this is their own canon so they don't have to do any of like the common Spidey rules. One of Batman's is that they never kill the Joker, yet he was killed in Arkham City, so I started thinking things may end bad for Aunt May, and sure enough she ends up dying. Peter has to choose between saving her or saving the entire city with the antidote to the bioweapon, and like the pure superhero he is, he chooses the entire city over Aunt May. He's not Joel from The Last of Us where he chooses one life over thousands. He makes the right call, and everything about the scene is absolutely incredible, and one of the best Spider-Man scenes in any medium I've ever seen. It cuts to a few months later and everything is good between Peter and MJ, because of course it is, and that's really where the main story ends. The first post-credit scene features Miles showing Peter that he has spider powers and vice versa, and this once again was just really cool to watch as a huge Miles Morales fan. I do think that'll probably be the star of one of the DLCs, so I'm really excited about that. And the second scene featured Norman checking on Harry, who's in some sort of green vat, presumably dying from this disease. Then at the very end, Norman puts his hand on the glass, and we start seeing hints of maybe a symbiote possibly coming towards him, and this also is just really cool and really intriguing. So obviously there's a lot of things in this ending that they're setting up for either for DLC or for the sequel. The game has already sold incredibly well, so I have no doubt that Insomniac will be making another one, and hopefully we can get these questions answered. So yeah, that's about it for the story overall. I went in with high hopes and came out really pleased. The ending with Otto and Aunt May will always be the thing that I first remember about the quality of this story. Like I mentioned, there's a lot going on all at once, which can be a bit frustrating to jump between all the different threads. However, all the moments between the characters like Peter, Miles, Aunt May, Otto, and MJ are all needed in order to form these relationships, with the exception of a few things I felt were a little forced or out of place, and just the pure amount of story things going on. I thought this was a very well done Spider-Man story that hit at the core of his character, which is what we all wanted it to see, and ended on an especially high note. This is one that I do feel will be remembered, especially for its unique take on all the characters, and its willingness to take risks across the board. Next, let's discuss the core gameplay elements of the game. So I'm going to split this up into multiple sections, and for now I'll be talking more in a general sense, and I'll talk more about specific moments later, where these moments are used in the main missions. So first let's talk about what is probably the most important aspect of any open world Spider-Man game, which is the traversal and web swinging. After the E3 2017 demo, we got our first look at the web swing, and I was actually really nervous because it looked really slow and like just sort of boring, and thankfully in the final release, web swinging is so incredible. I could tell that when I didn't ever want to do any of the missions, I just spent all my time swinging from building to building. Having your overall traversal speed increases a nice touch, and all the different aspects from the seamless parkour to the wall running to the dive bombing and the point launches you can do are amazing, and I really have absolutely no criticisms in this area. Next, moving on to the actual Spider-Man combat, it's really good. Now obviously people are going to compare it to Arkham because of course they are. Any superhero game that's made of all time now will always be compared to Arkham, but that's all people have really wanted from Spider-Man combat. The fighting in Arkham was always way more Spider-Man-esque than Batman-esque, so if anything it makes more sense in this game. Even at the most bare bones beginner level where you can really only press square to punch, it still is really fun. Being able to press triangle to do a web swing to get closer to enemies is one of my favorite additions, and always keeps you in the action of the fight. And also something that I really love that also really surprised me is being able to fight in midair for ridiculous amounts of time. After certain upgrades you can punch someone up in the air and then keep punching them, and then web them to the ground, and then like web them up into the air again, and then throw something at them, all while you're still floating in the air. Does it make any sense? No, not really, but it's fun and really fluid and awesome to experience. If you perfectly counter an enemy, then he webs the enemy you're countering, which is nice, and the environmental attacks with L1 and L2 are also really fun and satisfying. There are also the cool takedowns by pressing square and triangle after you have your focus bar filled up with awesome animations and like these really awesome takedowns that I just never got sick of. I did notice, however, a bunch of times where the camera would just kind of freak out during these takedowns and you can't really see anything. They didn't happen too much though, so they weren't a big deal. There are also these really satisfying wall attacks you can do just by pressing circle near a wall, and it's awesome. And the gadgets are also really cool and fun to mess around with, and I like that it's not really a limit on what's allowed during stealth and full-on combat. You can kind of mix and match gadgets whatever you want, and it's just really fun while you're in the middle of combat to shoot a web bomb or electric webbing at someone and see what happens. You can create really awesome combos with these, and also with the new suit powers. For these, I was pretty excited to see what they would do with the suit powers. However, during the game, I didn't really have much variety with them. I mainly used the Web Blossom and the Spider Bro since they're really good and pretty much overpowered. However, if you mess around with a lot of them, they're pretty cool and creative, and some of them, like the Quips one, are just kind of fun to have in the game. Overall, the entire combat system is just a blast to play around with. Keep in mind it doesn't do too much to reinvent the wheel, but it didn't have to, and I couldn't have asked for much more when it came from a Spider-Man game when it comes to traversal and combat. Next is stealth, which is something that we didn't really see too much of revealed before release, so I was pretty interested to see how it would turn out. And thankfully, it's pretty good. It's obviously best during the main story levels where they just have a very well designed level with numerous spots for you to hide and crawl around. In this game, there really is no better feeling for me than just crawling around on the ceiling while you hide from your enemies. You're able to do web strike takedowns, which if you're hidden are always a one-hit knockout, which I initially didn't like because I felt it was like too easy. However, I've gotten used to it now and I think I'm okay with it. There are also these perch takedowns which look really cool and will definitely remind you of the takedowns from the noir segments of Shattered Dimensions. This is all in addition to all the different things you can do with all the gadgets, like distracting someone with webs, or putting out the web trip mine to take out multiple enemies, or attaching it to someone and just takes both of them out together. Obviously, I do really like the stealth overall, and surprisingly it has a lot more variety and freedom than I initially thought it would from all the demos and gameplay stuff that we've seen before release. Especially if you're doing it really fast and you just have like a flow to it, it can be really awesome. Also, if you are doing a stealth section on a building in the city, then you actually have the freedom to use the other buildings around you, and you're not just limited to the actual buildings where the enemies are located, which is awesome and something that for some reason surprised me. It also is worth noting that for all the gameplay, it controls very well, even for someone like me who hasn't used a PS4 controller in about a year. I found it really easy to get back into it, and everything about the game that I was worried about just controls very smoothly. The only controls I found a little frustrating were during combat, and the camera would mess up so I couldn't really see anything, and that would occasionally get me killed, and I did have also some occasional issues with wall crawling. So yeah, the stealth system for the most part is great, but pretty simple. It does enough of what it needs to do to be a great Spider-Man stealth system, I would say. I couldn't really have asked for more, but in the sequel, I definitely could see how it could be improved by adding more elements to it and including more well-designed stealth levels. And finally, let's move on to all the gameplay that isn't Spider-Man, so Peter, Mary Jane, and Miles. Before we get to my thoughts, it does need to be said that just on an animation level, I think these sections are very well done. It really reminded me of playing a AAA Naughty Dog game or something like that, just how they ran and how they moved, and it looked really solid. Like I said before with Spidey Combat, I'm just going to talk more about all these specifically when we get to the story missions, but just in a general sense right now. So the Peter stuff I thought was pretty fine. Most of what you'll be doing is just walking around, but when you're in Otto's lab, you'll have these weird puzzles that you can do. There's only 2 types of them, and I thought they were okay at first, however they just started getting a little boring for me towards the latter half of the game. They reminded me a lot of the hacking from BioShock, which I thought was pretty fun in that game, but here it just got boring after a while. I was always really wanting to get back to either the story or more Spider-Man gameplay. Most of them actually were pretty tricky, which I guess is good, but they also include an option to skip them after like 5 minutes. I thought this was kind of dumb since if you're going to include the sections, make them important enough where the player actually has to do them. Having a prompt that just allows you to skip it seems like they're admitting defeat and they know that you don't want to be doing this. It never really dragged down the entire game for me, but for the sequel we definitely need Peter Parker free roam and some better ways to spend our time while playing as him. Now, the Mary Jane gameplay, which I know is probably one of the most controversial things of this game, and I can definitely see why. So it starts out as being fine, as just the most bare bones basic stealth possible, but it didn't really bother me. However, eventually it starts getting really boring and really annoying, and it was just too dumbed down for me. Later in the game it starts picking back up again, but then it ends, and thankfully I was really happy when it did, and I'm not sure if it was really the best decision to include this in the game. Again, I'll talk more about the specifics later, but I just didn't really do it for me. It did do a good job of keeping Mary Jane actually important to the story, but I feel like that could have been done without dedicating a handful of gameplay sequences to her that just included the most basic stealth in existence. And finally, the Miles stuff is also average. We didn't know we were actually going to be able to play as Miles in this game, which was a pretty big surprise, and when I finally got to it, it's pretty similar to the Mary Jane stuff. However, Miles can also access collectibles in the form of Daily Bugle newspapers, and he has this hacking ability with his phone that also makes his stealth a little bit more dynamic and a lot more enjoyable than Mary Jane's. Again, I don't really think that most of his gameplay segments were really needed either. There were a few that I thought were great, like after the City Hall explosion, but it wasn't really because of the gameplay. I felt like Peter's was mostly warranted since it had a lot of story involvement, but Mary Jane's definitely wasn't. Again, it wasn't the worst thing in the history of video games ever, and it normally was pretty bearable because everything else going on around it was great. However, the gameplay itself could have used some improvement for me for all the characters as a whole. And with that, let's move on to the main missions of the story themselves. So the game starts with Spider-Man on his way to Fisk Tower to go take on the Kingpin. You've got the classic red and blue suit, and it looks great. Everything about the first mission and the setup to it is actually really awesome. It does a great job of introducing you to the basic gameplay elements, and by the time you're finally done with the boss battle, you feel pretty competent with your abilities as Spider-Man. Also, the Kingpin boss fight is actually pretty awesome for basically being a tutorial. Also, just a moment that stood out was when I was fighting Kingpin, and then all his other thugs came in around him. Just because you're in a certain combat sequence with the Kingpin, and then someone like throws something at you, for example, doesn't mean that what you're doing with the Kingpin just goes away because you're already fighting the boss. You actually have to focus on all the enemies, including the boss, at once around you, and try to take each of them out. But yeah, the Kingpin boss fight was awesome, and actually pretty large scale as they started flying through the building and destroying everything around them. Next, you also get introduced to the Peter gameplay, like I already mentioned, and just do some of the dumb puzzles for the first time, and some of the first few missions of the game are just dedicated to setting up the city content, such as the radio towers or the crimes, or just anything like that, but I'll talk about that when I talk about all the city stuff in a little bit. But really the next sort of big thing is when you play as Peter and visit the Feast Shelter for the first time. It's pretty cool, and you can definitely tell the amount of detail that they put into the Feast Shelter design, since you can explore all of it to your heart's content, and talk to different homeless people, and there's all these different dialogue options you have, not dialogue options, but just all these different things that you can like talk to people about, and it's just really cool. The mission Don't Touch the Art also stood out as being pretty cool, as it was really our first big stealth sequence when you got to play as Spider-Man, and I thought it was pretty fun. It's also the first Mary Jane mission which I thought was fun enough. You also are introduced to Shocker later, which initially seems like it's just going to be the Firefly side mission from Arkham Knight, which I was really disappointed about, and which really sucks, since basically you just chase him around a bunch. So I really thought that's what we were going to do in this game, and I got worried, but thankfully we do get a pretty awesome boss fight with him later. And even though I'd seen most of the gameplay from it ahead of release since they'd released it early, it was still a blast to finally play through, and definitely a standout from the main missions. The mission's Wheels Within Wheels was next, and I absolutely loved everything about this. It's where you meet Jefferson Davis, and really not too much happens, it's pretty simple, but it was just so much fun, and the dialogue between the two was really entertaining. I also just appreciate how they actually have story reasons for why Spider-Man gets his different upgrades, such as the electric webbing, coming from Jefferson's stun gun. The electric webbing also introduces these new kind of puzzles you have to do, which aren't really puzzles, as they're just super simple and you follow the yellow line to these different electrical boxes, but they were still fun enough, and it was a nice change of pace. It was also just actually fun having a fight with the cops, like being able to actually have them on your side, and have someone on your side besides just nameless cops, as Jefferson had a stun gun and was helping you take on the demons. The mission Home Sweet Home also is right after this, and once again is one of the most Spider-Man feeling moments of the game. It's just Peter trying to find his stuff after he's evicted by his apartment by talking to a sanitation worker, and it was just awesome and a really perfectly themed Spider-Man mission. Also, not too long after this, we got the mission Straw Meat Camel, which was actually the mission from E3 2017 at Fisk's construction site. I had pretty high hopes when I saw that this was the mission I was about to play, and thankfully it was really good. Something about the way it visually looked really stood out to me. I can't really nail down what it was, but it was just bright, and I loved that it was right in the middle of the day, and I just loved how it looked. And just the freedom you had exploring the entire construction site, and really being able to go wherever you wanted was awesome. It was just very well designed, and had such fluidity going between all the different objectives, and all the different gang members that you had to save. It was also just cool having a different perspective on this, after watching it so many times now for the last year, and finally being able to play it, and see what had changed. Also, the mission and the award goes to was also spectacular, not really due to gameplay reasons, but from a story level and a presentation level that I already discussed. And the mission Dinner Date is very similar, as it also has huge story significance that I found really entertaining. But from a gameplay level, playing as Mary Jane was once again just fine. Up the Water Spout was also spectacular though, and definitely one of my favorites in the game. It has a nice mix of everything with fun traditional Spidey combat, and also a very well designed stealth sequence with so many different options to explore. Also, I enjoyed the mission Back to School way way more than I thought I would. It's just Peter going back to ESU at a costume party, where he gets to stay dressed up as his costume in Spider-Man. Again, nothing too amazing from a gameplay level really, you're just kind of walking around for most of it and investigating, but it had so many throwbacks to classic Spider-Man comics and villains that I just loved it. I also just loved after Mr. Negative mind controls some of the students that are dressed as classic Spider-Man villains. It kind of looks like you're fighting these classic versions, like these lesser versions of the classic Spider-Man villains, and it was just a really neat touch. The mission Spider Hack also wasn't too different in terms of gameplay, but for some reason I just found it really fun and memorable and worth noting here, and the mission Uninvited was where I started getting really tired of the Mary Jane stealth. It wasn't drastically different from the others, but it was just the point where I started getting extremely bored and was really anxious to go back to Spider-Man. First Day was also a pretty solid mission and another pretty entertaining use of Miles' gameplay, and does a good job of improving the relationship between Spidey and Miles. The mission Collision Course is also a nice change of pace, as basically fighting all these dudes on a moving car, and the mission The One That Got Away was another Mary Jane mission. However, this one I actually really appreciated and really enjoyed. It was actually creative, as you get to command Spider-Man from Mary Jane's perspective, where he attacks people and when he distracts them, and just different things like that. More creativity like that is what I really would have loved to see in some of the other Mary Jane stuff, but for this one I really enjoyed it. And we finally get to the raft mission, which I was really excited to finally play, and it did not disappoint. There's so much before we even get to the Electro part, where he's fighting these criminals all around the raft and all over the island, and you really have the freedom to go not wherever you want, but really kind of just do whatever you want in the area that they give you, and it's just really awesome. The entire atmosphere with the rain and just everything going on in the mission was very well done, and once you get to the Electro part that we'd already seen before, it was really awesome. So yeah, after this, Otto releases the virus in the city, and something I really appreciated was that everything about the city changes after this. If you swing around, you'll see the people have masks on now, and criminals are just running around setting up shop on rooftops all over New York. This effect is also continued in the Into the Fire mission, which was awesome as you were just kind of running around the city, helping the people that you can and controlling what you could after criminals are running rampant. There's also a really unique sequence where you have to rescue a bunch of cops being held hostage by Electro, and it was just really fun and pretty uniquely designed. We also get to the Electro and Vulture boss fight, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think it was a smart decision making the Sinister Six boss fights as pairs for 4 of them. It made them more interesting, and you also didn't have to go through 4 different boss fights for all these characters that we kind of already known. Fighting 2 of the enemies at once was just a lot more fun, and actually made a lot of the fights harder, as you had to account for both of their abilities while just focusing on one that you were trying to take out. And while most of the boss fights were pretty simple, I couldn't see how they could have been done much better. They were visually really pleasing, a lot of fun, and even though some of them relied on quick time events occasionally and got a little repetitive, I still enjoyed them. We also got the Streets of Poison mission, where you get poisoned by Scorpion and have to go through this hallucination thing, like the whole city's hallucination, and you have to try and get an antidote. And to be honest, I really did not like this mission. This is really the only one in the entire game that I can remember off the top of my head that I didn't enjoy, and I don't know why every game feels the need now to have some sort of hallucination sequence. I just found it really boring, and I just wanted to get back to the actual Scorpion fight and not have to worry spending almost 30 minutes just swinging around in a hallucination. There were some cool parts like Scorpion's tail coming out out of the city when you're swinging around and having like the undie Spidey costume and all that, but overall I was not a fan and was really happy when it ended. Thankfully, after this we do have the Rhino and Scorpion boss fight, which I thought was really awesome. I'd say I probably enjoyed it less than the Vulture and Electro one, but it was still pretty fun, and once again the dynamic of fighting 2 villains at once was a great decision made by Insomniac that improved the fight so much. We also have the mission Step Into My Parlor, which was probably my favorite Mary Jane mission. You get a stun gun here so you actually can do takedowns, which makes it a little bit more enjoyable and makes it feel more like an actual video game you're playing instead of just like some weird stealth simulator. And I thought the penthouse was actually pretty well designed, and it was just a lot of fun exploring Norman's penthouse to see all the different Spidey Easter eggs and all the different Easter eggs just from the comics, stuff for Harry, Green Goblin stuff, and just everything like that. So yeah, this mission was really good, and I also just loved the ending cutscene where MJ jumps off the building and Spidey of course saves her. We also get the Mr. Negative boss fight, which I didn't think was anything too amazing, but it was fun and definitely served as a pretty climactic ending to his character without the fight becoming too repetitive. And finally we prepare for the Doc Ock boss fight by Peter making a new suit called the Anti-Ock suit that looks really awesome. And when we get to the fight itself, it's actually really intense, and for me going into it with pretty high expectations, I did think it was really good. I thought it started getting a little bit repetitive, like just a tiny bit towards the end, but overall the scale was there, the presentation was there, and it was just really fun and really enjoyable. So yeah, that's really it for the main missions themselves. Like I said, there were a couple of standouts that I really enjoyed that definitely make me think this is the best Spider-Man game mission-wise that's ever been released. Even the ones that didn't hit that huge level, I still thought were really fun, and there were only pretty much, like I said, 1 or 2 missions I thought got a little boring, and that was really only some Mary Jane stuff and the Streets of Poison mission. Overall, I definitely need this New Game Plus mode to come out really soon so I can start replaying all these missions on my main account, since so many of them were such a blast and so well designed. And with that, I'm just kind of move on to some other technical stuff about the game, other city and the content, side missions, and just everything else I couldn't really fit into another category in this video. So first, let's start with the open world. We've had numerous open world Spidey games in the last few years, and I'm sure it was a huge endeavor to create an open world New York filled with meaningful content, and I'd say that Insomniac sorta did, maybe. Let's just talk about all the different things that there are to do, and then we'll get into the general stuff later. Also, I will say that all the things I'm about to mention have unlockable tokens that you can use to craft upgrades, suits, gadgets, and just all that type of thing, and I think that's a really cool way of doing it. So first are the backpacks, which are the most collectible, I guess, esque item in the entire game. There's 55 of them, and if you kind of focus on getting them, they'll go really fast. Since you can go so fast, like the web swing traversing around the city, you will get them very quickly. And there's 55 of them, like I said, scattered around the city, and I really appreciate that they have a canon reason for being there, as Peter would have backpacks stored with all his personal belongings around New York. Now, would he have bought 55 backpacks in the span of 8 years? No, probably not, but whatever. I also think it's really awesome how the backpacks are filled with tons of Easter eggs from Spider-Man's extensive history. They've got pretty much everything from his classic web shooters to his original camera, and like cracked visors and just that type of thing, and also a nice little audio description to go along with each. Normally I wouldn't even mention collectibles like this, but in the game I actually wanted to see what nods they would have to Spidey's history that I'll be able to discover. And you also get the MCU homemade suit once you find all of them, which is a pretty fitting and a nice suit. So, next are going to be the towers, which I was a little disappointed by, and are probably one of the most uncreative aspects of the game. They're essentially exactly what you think they would be. There are like these certain amount of them in each city, you swing to one, do the little wavelength minigame from Arkham Knight, and then you have that part of the map unlocked. They're fine, however, I think they could have been done a lot better. Something just maybe a little bit more creative to make them more unique. Make the minigames more memorable, or just find a fun Spidey-driven reason to have these structures around the city that you need to activate. Once again, it doesn't bring down the game or anything, but it's definitely something extremely forgettable about the open world. Next are also going to be the research stations. So these actually have a pretty cool canonical reason for existing in the world. Basically, Harry Osborn, before he got sick, set up these different stations with his mom across the city. Each of them has a unique purpose and results in pretty varied objectives. Some of them allow you to change the time of day during the challenge, which was a nice touch, and some of the missions themselves are pretty much just short challenges that vary from things like web swinging to combat, but they were more fun than I expected. These actually got sort of creative, and I was really surprised with some of them, and I never really got bored. Overall, I'd say these were a pretty solid addition to the open world. There's also what should be a staple of any superhero video game, which are random crimes around the city. These are exactly what they should be and what you would expect them to be, as either the demons, criminals, or Sable agents are doing something bad that you have to stop. There's a certain amount of them in each region of the city. Again, nothing really to say, they're just fun to come across and stop. Another thing to do in the city that was surprisingly engaging were the landmarks. So you go around New York just taking pictures of all the different landmarks for these landmark tokens. It was a pretty cool thing since you basically get to explore the city and also learn a little bit more about the real New York landmarks. There are also all the fun Greater Marvel Universe locations like everything in Hell's Kitchen, Avengers Tower, the Sanctum Sanctorum, and the Wakandan Embassy. So yeah, these were just really awesome and I completed them way faster than I thought I would, and I really appreciated their inclusion in this game. There were also the Black Cat stakeouts across the city, and that aren't really that many of them, so I was a little disappointed, but the ones we do get are fine. From a story level, there's pretty much nothing going on. It's just Black Cat leaves these little puzzle things around the city to pretty much distract Spider-Man so she can steal her gear back. However, we do know that the first DLC will be all about her and Spider-Man's story, so I'm sure it will be explored there. But for all her different stakeout locations, you basically do these telescope things where you have a telescope and you have to try and locate these Black Cats hidden. They're extremely simple, and while not terrible, they just aren't very memorable. I definitely feel that Black Cat's memorable content in this game will definitely come from her DLC when she's actually, really present. It is cool though that you get the dark suit when you finish them all, and you can actually tell that it's made by Black Cat, and it's got the cat marks and all that on there. It was pretty cool. Another sort of related side mission are the Taskmaster challenges. These I was really surprised by since Taskmaster is a pretty cool villain, but he's rarely ever used. Like the Black Cat stuff, the story is pretty simple. He puts these challenges all around the city for Spider-Man to do so he can observe him and then they can fight. The challenges themselves range from average to really fun. They're either stealth sequences, full-on combat, drone races, or disarming bombs. Both the combat and stealth challenges I had a ton of fun completing, since once again the gameplay is just so solid. Even the bomb disarming ones though I thought were pretty enjoyable. However, it just didn't really have that same amount of fun going into the drone races, since they weren't that exciting and just sort of dragged on. You do eventually get to the boss fight, and it's one of the most average ones in the game probably. I do love his design, and seeing him use Spider-Man's own moves against him was awesome. However, it did get a little bit repetitive and just wasn't too creative. I still thought it was fun though, and I really enjoyed the Taskmaster even got to be in this game. There are also, like any other superhero game, criminal warehouses, like for Fisk's gang, demons, Sable agents, and criminals, for you to go take out all around the city. I actually enjoyed how much time each of them took, since it was so much fun and you didn't really feel like you were just flying through all of them really fast. They're all really awesome, and having the freedom to approach most of them any way you want is really welcome. They also have all the different objectives for each one that encourage even more replayability, since you get more base tokens if you complete them. Overall, very good job to Insomniac on creating fulfilling gang hideouts that were actually fun to complete. And finally, probably the most well-known post-story content of a game are going to be the side missions, and this games are pretty good. Most of them aren't spectacular, but I definitely say they did the job, and they didn't stand out as being terrible or anything. You can definitely tell the ones though where most of the time and energy was put forth, and the ones that were just kind of thrown in. Especially the ones that have full-on cutscenes and a story like the Tombstone one are awesome. Even though just like the Taskmaster fight, the boss fight wasn't great, it was better than that, and it was pretty cool especially for being a side mission. Also, there's this mission which has like a Twitch streamer that I thought was dumb, but it entertained me and I just thought it was kind of stupid fun. However, many of them were extremely short and very simple. Again, even the missions that are super dumbed down and like pretty stupid, like the chasing the pigeons one for that dude Howard, are still pretty fun, since once again the gameplay is just so good. I know it's a lot to ask, but it is worth noting that more time definitely could have been put forth into making a lot of the side missions more meaningful, and that's really about it for story content. And just kind of some closing random things, all the different interactions Spider-Man has in the open world city, like talking to people and being able to high-five them and take selfies, are all really awesome attentions to detail. Also, the J. Jonah Jameson broadcast is great, and I enjoyed it way more than I initially thought I would. It's just really entertaining to hear his dialogue while you're swinging around the city, and it's just really well written, and a lot of what he says is genuinely funny, and always pertains to the current story, and entertaining while you're just swinging around. I love that you can actually take pictures anytime you want, especially while in midair, and speaking of pictures, the photo mode is really incredible. I have never ever cared about taking pictures until this game came out in a photo mode, but it's so good. All the different settings and options you have to customize are great, and I'm just shocked it's so addicting. The way they implemented fast travel also was pretty creative, and even though I've literally only used it once, since once again swinging is just so much fun, it's so cool that the option's there and the way it is. The load times in the game are also extremely quick, which was a nice touch, and something I'm very thankful for. And the game also looks beautiful, and if you were curious about the whole downgrade controversy, I would not worry about it at all. Obviously I ran into a few glitches through my time with the game, but nothing terrible, and it is worth noting that the game did crash probably around 3 times since I've gotten it over 2 weeks ago, which really isn't bad for a new AAA release. And finally, the last thing are going to be the suits. I do love that the suits appear in cutscenes, and most of them look incredible. And for the suit selection itself, I'm pretty pleased. There were definitely some suits that I was surprised how good they looked in the game, like the Stark suit, the Scarlet Spider one, and the all-new all-different suit, which is probably my favorite of the entire game. However, there were some wasted spots in my opinion, like the Wrestler suit, which I just was never really a huge fan of. Like, it's cool having it, but I don't really want a spot taken up by it. The Spirit Spider one, which just looks kind of gross, and the Fear Itself one, which looks like it's disgusting. I don't know why that's there. They look terrible. I am sure though we will get those fan favorite suits that we were missing, like the Raimi suit, in the DLC, so I'm not too worried. And that is finally it, guys. I think I've talked about every possible element I could of this game, so hopefully it wasn't too long, but you'll be able to skip around to certain sections if you really want to. Obviously this video took a ton of time to make, so I hope you enjoyed it and are definitely enjoying the game if you have it. In case you can't tell, I am a huge fan of it, and I definitely lived up to the hype for me. Pretty much everything about the game is superb except for a few story things, some side content, and some missions in the game that I just thought were a little weak. However, there's only a few story, mission, and gameplay gripes I have, but the good far outweighs the bad, and I 100% recommend this game to anyone that has a PlayStation, and if you're a big fan of Spider-Man like me, maybe even consider buying a PlayStation just to play this game. The story and campaign and main missions are that engaging, I promise you guys. So tell me what you guys thought of my review, and what you think about the game if you've gotten a chance to play it, and thank you guys for watching.